Chapter 1. The Eve of Pearl Harbor. Wars came early to Shanghai, overtaking each other like the tides that raced up the Yangtze, and returned to this gaudy city, all the coffins cast adrift from the funeral pyres of the Chinese Bund. Jim had begun to dream of wars. At night, the same silent film seemed to flicker against the wall of his bedroom in Amherst Avenue, and transformed his sleeping mind into a deserted newsreel theatre. During the winter of 1941, everyone in Shanghai was showing war films. Fragments of his dreams followed Jim around the city. In the foyers of department stores and hotels, the images of Dunkirk and Tobruk, Barbarossa and the rape of Nanking sprang loose from his crowded head. To Jim's dismay, even the Dean of Shanghai Cathedral had equipped himself with an antique projector. After morning service on Sunday, 7th of December, the eve of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the choir boys were stopped before they could leave for home and were marched down to the crypt. Still wearing their cassocks, they sat in a row of deck chairs requisitioned from the Shanghai Yacht Club and watched a year-old march of time. Thinking of his unsettled dreams, and puzzled by their missing soundtrack, Jim tugged at his ruffed collar. The organ voluntary drummed like a headache through the cement roof, and the screen trembled with the familiar images of tank battles and aerial dogfights. Jim was eager to prepare for the fancy-dress Christmas party being held that afternoon by Dr. Lockwood, the vice-chairman of the British Residents Association. There would be the drive through the Japanese lines to Hangzhou, and then Chinese conjurers, fireworks, and yet more newsreels. But Jim had his own reasons for wanting to go to Dr. Lockwood's party. Outside the vestry doors, the Chinese chauffeurs waited by their Packards and Buicks, arguing in a fretful way with each other. Bored by the film, which he had seen a dozen times, Jim listened as Yang, his father's driver, badgered the Australian verger. However, watching the newsreels had become every expatriate Briton's patriotic duty, like the fundraising raffles at the country club, the dances and garden parties, the countless bottles of scotch consumed in aid of the war effort. Like all children, Jim was intrigued by alcohol, but vaguely disapproved of it, had soon produced enough money to buy a Spitfire, probably one of those, Jim speculated, that had been shot down on its first flight, the pilot fainting in the reek of Johnny Walker. Usually Jim devoured the newsreels, part of the propaganda effort mounted by the British Embassy to counter the German and Italian war films being screened in the public theatres and Axis clubs of Shanghai. Sometimes the Pathé newsreels from England gave him the impression that, despite their unbroken series of defeats, the British people were thoroughly enjoying the war. The March of Time films were more sombre in a way that appealed to Jim. Suffocating in his tight cassock, he watched a burning hurricane fall from a sky of Dornier bombers towards a children's book landscape of English meadows that he had never known. The Graf Spee lay scuttled in the River Plate, a river as melancholy as the Yangtze, and smoke clouds rose from a shabby city in Eastern Europe, that black planet from which Vera Frankel, his 17-year-old governess, had escaped on a refugee ship 6 months earlier. Jim was glad when the newsreel was over. He and his fellow choristers tottered into the strange daylight towards their chauffeurs. His closest friend, Patrick Maxted, had sailed with his mother from Shanghai for the safety of the British fortress at Singapore, and Jim felt that he had to watch the films for Patrick, and even for the White Russian women selling their jewellery on the cathedral steps, and the Chinese beggars resting among the gravestones. The commentator's voice still boomed inside his head as he rode home through the crowded Shanghai streets in his parents' Packard. Yang, the fast-talking chauffeur, had once worked as an extra in a locally made film starring Chiang Ching, the actress who had abandoned her career to join the communist leader Mao Tse-tung. Yang enjoyed impressing his 11-year-old passenger with tall tales of film stunts and trick effects. But today, Yang ignored Jim, banishing him to the back seat. He punched the Packard's powerful horn, carrying on his duel with the aggressive rickshaw coolies who tried to crowd the foreign cars off the bubbling Well Road. Lowering the window, Yang lashed with his leather riding crop at the thoughtless pedestrians, the sauntering bar girls with American handbags, the old ammers bent double under bamboo yokes strung with headless chickens.